who is quick to borrow is slow to pay. Isn't this Sri Lanka? Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is domestic debt restructuring. Who will ultimately pay the price? To discuss all this and more, we've invited four guests to our studios this evening as well. Joining us this evening on the show are Murtaza Jafferji, Chairman of the Advocata Institute; Damit Pallavata, Deputy General Manager, Hatton National Bank; Dr. M. Ganeshamurthy, Department of Economics, University of Colombo, and also Attorney at Law, Manjuka Fernandopulle. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation.
Thank you.
To pose questions from our panelists, onto my immediate right is Niresh, onto my immediate left is Shania, and onto my far left is Jamal, who's joining us this evening on the show to pose questions to our panelists. You could also direct your questions on the number 076 656 5353. The number once again, 076 656 5353. And we would love to take those questions to the panelists as the show goes along. So let's start off tonight's show with Murtaza Jafferji, Chairman of the Advocata Institute, who will give us an overview with regard to what our topic today is and what it means to organizations like the Advocata Institute. So let's start off with Murtaza Jafferji, Chairman of the Advocata Institute.
So let me frame the problem. There has been an old adage that Sri Lanka has always been living far beyond its means, and that is the crux of the problem. So we have celebrated 75 years of independence, and if you look at the government's budget, except for 4 years, a couple of years in 2017 and 18 and a couple of years in the 1950s, we have been posting what is called a primary balance deficit, which means it is the government revenue minus expenditure without interest. So it is this accumulation of these primary balances over the years that created the foundation for the debt. Now, when you pile on debt, it will also attract interest, and this interest over time snowballs. So just as a saver is told that compound interest is your best friend, if you are a borrower, it's your worst enemy. So what has happened to Sri Lanka is that the debt has snowballed to a level where it is unsustainable relative to the size of the economy. And that has precipitated this debt crisis. To give you some examples, the debt, which is the public sector debt, which includes the central government and the guaranteed state-owned enterprises and the central bank, has been estimated by the IMF to be 128% of GDP. For a middle-income market country like Sri Lanka, market access country like Sri Lanka, the safe level should be around 70%. So we are way past any kind of red line. And the interest cost is currently about 6.5% of GDP, which is one of the highest in the world. There's another metric called gross financing needs, which is the amount of debt that comes due every year. For last year, that amount of debt was about 30% of GDP. So as per our IMF agreement, we have to bring that 30% of GDP down to 13% of GDP in 4 years, which means that the primary balance deficit, which was 4% last year, has to be flipped to 2.3% in 4 years' time. And the amount of debt that is coming due every year, which is estimated at 26% of GDP, has to be brought down to 15% of GDP. So these are the parameters under which this whole issue of debt and its restructuring is to be done. About 50% of this debt is externally owed because the currency depreciated by something like 60% from 200 to 320, and the balance is owed domestically. The domestic debt is mainly in the form of treasury bills, accounting for about 4.7 trillion, and bonds, which are more longer term securities, which total about 9 trillion. And there is some debt owed to the central bank, which is called provisional advances of about 400 to 500 billion. So this sums up the problem that there is an enormous amount of debt that your economy is carrying. And the best analogy I can give to your viewers is it's like some of us carrying a very large load on our head. Our ability to operate normally is significantly impacted the larger the load that we carry on our shoulders. And therefore, this load has to be reduced. And that is the premise of this debt restructuring. So the question is that who is going to participate in this adjustment is the question. There are two constituencies, as I spoke about the primary balance. One is that the tax revenues have to be significantly increased so that the primary balance can be brought to a surplus. The other is the debt holders to whom there are principal payments and periodic coupon payments and interest to be paid. They have to participate in some kind of restructuring where this can be more manageable about by stretching out the time period, reducing some of the interest rates, and in a very selective cases, the principal amount owed may also have to be adjusted. So that, Shamin, sums up the problem.
When you say the principal amounts need to be adjusted, what does that mean?
So for example, if you have an instrument that has a face value of 100 rupees, which means at maturity you are going to get 100, and the interim period that you are going to get an interest payment, which for a debt security is called a coupon. In very selective cases, the principal may have to be adjusted. It will be more so for the commercial debt rather than the domestic debt. The external commercial debt may have to have some kind of principal adjustment, but unlikely for local debt.
So I was listening to one of your speeches lately, Murtaza, and you say that when it comes to domestic debt, it has to be proportionately divided amongst all. And that should be the premise in which the government should start acting. So that means when it comes to treasury bills, there needs to be a haircut. When it comes to treasury bonds, there needs to be a haircut. What percentage do you suggest?
Yeah. So we have to be careful with the terminology that is used. When you normally use the terminology of haircut, that means you are adjusting the principal. And it is not necessarily at this stage that you will need to adjust the principal. So the definition of haircut may not be relevant, but what will be needed is that the maturities of these instruments. So what is called the average term to maturity, that if you take the totality of the bonds outstanding, the average maturity of that is about 4 years. And since we have to stagger this over a longer period of time to get the gross financing needs down, which means the amount of debt that comes due every year that needs to be rolled over. So if there's a lot of money that is coming due every year and needs to be rolled over, the risk is increasing because of that. So you've got to push this out as much as possible. You will have to probably start adjusting the maturities, which is called reprofiling. And some of the coupons, which would range between 6% and 20%, will have to be adjusted to a more manageable amount, considering that inflation and interest rates are expected to come down significantly by the end of this year, that there is no justification to pay this kind of very, very high coupons for the next 10 years or shorter perhaps.
So another one more question, then I want to move to Damit Pallava, the Deputy General Manager of Hatton National Bank. So when you say that the government needs to take action to ensure that the cash flow remains as it is, let's say I invest 1 million rupees on a treasury bill with an expectation of a 32% interest for a period of 3 months, what's the impact it's going to create on me?
Okay, so you got to understand, and we can dig into this a little bit, that of the total domestic debt, which is in the form of securities, 9 trillion is in the form of bonds, which are much more longer term securities, and the treasury bills are about 4.7 trillion. I'm subject to correction because every week it kind of changes.
Yeah.
Out of the 4.7 trillion, about 2.6 trillion is owned by the central bank. The rest is owned by the public. And there is a list of people towards the end of 2022 based on institutional who owns it. And then you have a whole bunch of bonds, of which 43% is owned by the EPF. The banking sector has about 30%. Then there are insurance companies, and then there are many different entities out there. So it's fairly distributed. So in answering to your question, it is highly unlikely that, and the central bank has come out and said this, both the Treasury and central bank gave a joint, presentation on this, that they will not restructure Treasury bills. And the reason you do not restructure Treasury bills unless it is totally unsustainable, because it's an instrument that the central bank uses for liquidity management and something called open market operations. So since the bulk of it is owned by the central bank, which is also owned by the government, restructuring will not have an excessive impact because the large amount of interest that the central bank earns goes back as dividends to the government. So the fact that you extend the maturity and reduce the coupon, you're taking it from one pocket and putting it into another pocket, so it won't have a significant impact and it can be done, and that is why they have come out and said that they will restructure it.
Right. Thank you very much, Murtaza Jafarji, Chairman of the Advocata Institute. Murtaza, I recollect a couple of years ago, before all this struck and Sri Lanka was in a dilemma, you came on Face the Nation and you said in your final remarks, we are in the ICU and the economy needs to be treated. Do you think the government is treating the economy well now?
So let's put it to you this way, taking into account the advisors that the government has got, and we have very erudite Sri Lankans. For the first time in my life, I have seen Team A batting for Sri Lanka. So I have a lot of confidence that we are getting the best possible advice that we can have access to. I mean, that doesn't mean that
Advocata is not an advisor to the president.
Not at all.
No.
As you say, Advocata is about advocating. Our mission is to communicate to people between the ages of 16 and 35. Coming back to the advice, we probably have some of the best doctors, if I use that analogy, advising, but it's still going to be painful.
Okay. Thank you very much, Murtaza, for your thoughts in the first round. I now move my attention to Damik Palewat, the Deputy General Manager, Hatton National Bank.
Thank you. Murtaza set the stage actually what the debt restructuring is going to be, what are the numbers that are in the market subject to possible debt restructuring. If you look at the banking sector, right? So whatever that we do with the restructuring, I think that has to be carefully looked at because we have invested public money in those instruments, treasury bills and treasury bonds. If you go back few years, starting probably 2019, since then, banking sector supporting the central bank and the government, kind of need to help the businesses, the Sri Lankan economy by providing moratoriums, providing restructuring, which are most of the time on unfavorable terms for the bank. So it already got some element of impairments which have never seen hitherto in their balance sheets. So that has depleted their capacity to absorb furthermore. So even though the debt restructuring is the topic of the, we want to take it up, so there is a bigger elephant in the room, that is the stage 3 loans and the impairments that are going to hit the balance sheets of the bank. So we have just seen, some of those are coming in as of December. We have seen impairments have increased as never before, the highest level.
So when you say, just want to get some clarity, Damit, when you say impairments, those are bad loans?
Those are bad loans.
Right, okay. So for the benefit of our viewers, to make it
because businesses are coming out of the moratoriums, they are not set, the economy is on the revival mode, they are not generating enough revenue. So obvious the banks are, recording those impairments over a period which has stressed their balance sheets. As of now, the banks are operating within the regulatory limits for capital adequacy and the liquidity coverage ratio and liquid asset ratios. If you look at the investments that the banks have made on the treasury bills, bonds and the government securities, so by regulation, banks are mandated to invest certain percentage in government the securities to maintain the LAR, which is a liquid asset ratio, and also the liquidity coverage ratio. So we are mandated. So every investment, the contra entry is a customer deposit. So we being the custodian, we go on and invested those money in treasury bills and treasury bond. So having taken the impairment pressure on the balance sheet, and also for prudence sake, so having seen that the ISBs have potential, as Murtaza said, the adjustment on the principal. So we have also made certain level of provision in the balance sheets as of last end of December and also first quarter this year.
So are you trying to say, Damit, that the banking sector in Sri Lanka is suffering at this very point of time?
I would say yes, because the banking sector is supporting the economy for last 4 years. So for the businesses to come out of what they have faced, because we get the depositors' money, even though the loans are not paid, we can't go and tell the depositor we can't pay your interest on the deposit. So we have been managing that, and it is stressed to a level that anything that we do with the holdings of banks has to be done carefully and see what are the resulting impact going to be.
So Damit, April generally is the month that bonuses are paid to employees. How much of bonuses did you pay for your employees this time when it came to the month of April?
So that depends on the performance, right?
Yeah, so let's say we averaged how many months did you pay?
So that depends on your performance structure, right? So
no, because most of the time the question is, the banking sector says that they are stressed and they seem to be paying bonuses of employees very handsomely. Now, I'm not just talking about HNB for that matter, but many other banks as well. They've declared dividends in certain cases as well, if you look at the balance sheets. So you see the banking sector being stressed, but not stressed to a point where it is the red light, is it?
I would have a different view, Shamir. Now, if you say banking sector is not stressed to the red light, so if you look at from a depositor's point of view, they would like to see the banks are kind of operating comfortably because they need the confidence that deposits are safe, which is indeed the case. But if you look at the dynamics of how the balance sheets are built up, what impact the capital of the banks have, and the reserves that have depleted, which needs to be replenished. So the efforts and the impact in terms of infusions will be very much higher.
I pose this question to you, why? Because Murtaza said that hard decisions, painful decisions have to be taken even now. When Ranil Wickremesinghe went into Parliament recently and said, if the banking sector wants to manage the country's economy, let them do it. Let them come to the forefront and manage the country's economy. What did you think about that statement now?
So let's look at this way.
Are you all trying to manage the country's economy? Are you putting too much stress on the president?
Let me put it this way.
No,
anyway, the banks are managing the country's economy by fueling much needed support to the.
Are you all putting pressure on the president?
Not necessarily the president, but we are supporting the industries and the businesses who have got stuck, going under the water.
Don't worry, Damit, I'll give you a lot of time when the second round starts to talk about that. Damit Palewat, Deputy General Manager of the Hatton National Bank. So I just want to make it clear to our viewers that Damit is the only individual who is representing a corporate entity in Sri Lanka on this stage. So we respectfully agree to all the thoughts that you express as an individual as well, Damit. If you want to absolve yourself from the post of Deputy General Manager of Hatton National Bank and being a bank on the show tonight, we respectfully agree to that as well. So there's no hard and fast rule. So we have respect of you coming on the show tonight. That's a bigger thought as far as we are concerned. So thank you very much, Damit, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. I now move attention to Dr. M. Ganeshamurthy, representing the Department of Economics, University of Colombo. What are your thoughts on domestic debt restructuring? You're very pessimistic, Dr. Ganeshamurthy. Let's talk with a bit of optimism today.
Right. I wanted to be optimistic, but unfortunately, the things are making to feel that more pessimistic like. Anyway, I'll try my best to to strike a balance between the two, to be neutral. What I thought of starting off with, for a layman, what is this domestic debt restructuring like? Why it is happening? What is the meaning of this restructuring? So if a person takes a loan and continually is doing the loan in order to repay the loan, and there's a situation where he could not borrow more. So there where it comes, what to do with the existing loan? So he is not in a position to repay the loans, and he could not take more loans as well. So he's in a bankrupt position. So there comes an institution like IMF and say that, okay, we'll help you, but you have to do these things. So you have to reduce your loan. And there where the debt restructuring comes. So this time, the IMF told that both international external debt and as well as domestic debt both need to be restructured.
Because that's point blankly said in the IMF recommendation.
Yeah, you have to reduce it because.
But they all say that the same treatment that is meted out for international debt holders should be meted out to the domestic debt holders as well.
To be fair.
To be fair.
To be fair.
So it has to be equality should remain, prevail.
To re-establish debt sustainability, and it should be acceptable to the society, both socially and politically as well. So they mentioned that also in the report. Any restructuring should be acceptable politically as well as socially. So that part is there. Even though the medicine is bitter, it should be given in a sugar-coated pill. That's how they put it. And why this is happening? Because the government has to maintain its sustainable debt level and also financing needs. And third, a comfortable debt ratio, GDP ratio. And this is the main objective why the restructuring is done. And how to do this? It is not just the government go and tell or dictate the debt owners or holder of this debt. We are going to restructure it like. So it's a kind of a negotiation process through which this should be achieved. In there, three ways or methods of restructuring are there. One is face value reduction. This is also known as a haircut. So the face value of the loan could be reduced with the discussion or negotiation up to a certain level acceptable to both the creditor and the debtor. Second method is the maturity extension. This is what we call the moratorium. So there, the nominal face value and the structure of the loan remain the same, but the repayment time could be extended. And third one is the coupon adjustment. So coupon adjustment is also to adjust the net present value of the future income so as to give some relief for the debtor who has taken the loan. So these are the three main methods.
But I thought, Dr. Ganesh, just to interrupt you there, I thought the haircut method, reprofiling, you didn't talk about it.
Yeah, reprofiling is what we call that the reprofiling is the name. Yeah.
Okay, that's a maturity extension.
Yeah,
okay,
maturity extension.
Right.
So therefore, these three methods are not used individually. They are not mutually exclusive as well. So they can be adapted in a mix. In a mix also it can be adapted, and in case of domestic debt, the first method may not be adapted, it seems, according to the communication so far.
You say, Dr. Ganesh Murthy, that people should be given the bitter pill after making sure that it's sugar-coated.
Yeah.
Would the people of Sri Lanka swallow that pill when you speak about domestic debt restructuring? Would they want their money to be reprofiled, or would they want a haircut, or would they agree for a maturity extensions or even coupon adjustments? Would they agree to this? Don't you think 7 months or 8 months down the line, people may be on the streets again because of this?
Well, there is a possibility of happening that, but see, we have prior examples of other countries, those who have went down, even serious cases like this. But
like example, give me a country that has gone down on such a path and messed it up.
1997 Asian crisis. During that period, you can see that a lot of countries have gone down.
Right. So we'll get back to you, Dr. Ganesh Murthy, with your thoughts on this subject momentarily as we go along. I want to now focus my attention on Attorney at Law Manjuka Fernandopulle. What are your thoughts on today's topic?
First of all, I would like to thank you for being on this show. It's a privilege to be from viewer to be in the panel, and that's a great privilege. And thank you, first of all. Let me just try to set the framework of what the conversation, I think, just to get the conceptual clarity of what we are trying to talk about. See, debt restructuring is just not about reducing debt burdens. It is about reducing debt burden to achieve debt sustainability. Now, debt sustainability is not merely from state of insolvency to insolvency. It is more about extraordinary debt reduction, both in terms of stock as well as flow, to create growth inducement in investments, and perhaps even more from a situation of uncertainty and instability to certainty and stability.
So, Manjuka, in your opinion, we all know that the IMF had very clearly articulated that whatever decisions that are being meted out should be socially and politically accepted. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think the people are ready to accept the IMF program when it comes to domestic debt restructuring?
IMF has no program on domestic. IMF, like, I think the conceptual understanding that the IMF only leads parameters. It has a DSA and debt sustainability, and it has distance parameters. Now the question is whether we have, the IMF has said that we need to achieve debt to GDP at a particular point. That is, I think, to the of the 95%. We need to create what in the another metrics or debt burdens is the gross financial needs, and that they have given. It is in that framework that they have looked at, and that's what we call the debt sustainability analysis. For Sri Lanka, it is what we call the market access debt sustainability analysis. It does. So the IMF gives a framework for debt, between the sort of the dance between the debt, various sections of debt. Sri Lanka has multilateral debtors, bilateral debtors, commercial debtors, commercial bond debtors, and commercial like the China CDB, which is a loans, and you get the domestic. And even the domestic, you get the bills, and also you get loans. For example, I think HMB, a lot of the banks have given guaranteed loans, government guaranteed loans, the RDA, and all those also form of the debt mix of the country. Now, it is that entire mix at how do you how do you reduce each section or whatever to achieve the parameters of what the IMF requires. IMF does not say that, you need to do X to Y. If you read the IMF report, what it talks about debt is domestic, it's illustrative thing. It does not prescribe. I think the understanding that IMF prescribes the way the debt is going to restructure, it is not. The IMF is there to sort of give a framework for the government to restructure. The DSA is that.
Manjuka, tell me, how will political considerations impact these IMF stipulations in the future?
Well, I don't think, politics, what do you mean political in the sense, are you talking at the board level of the IMF, or are you talking of...
No, I'm talking politics in Sri Lanka.
Stipulation of the IMF. IMF will stipulate, IMF will have to, it keeps its program, it's asked to decide whether you want to engage or not engage. So where the IMF stipulations are there,
let's say hypothetically there is an election.
Yes.
In the future, I don't know whether President Ranil Wickremesinghe will resort to an election or not. That is a big question mark. Let's say there is an election and there is a change of government.
Yeah.
How would this impact the IMF?
Well, it depends. IMF is there. Like the bonds, let me say, without IMF program, nobody will come to the table to negotiate, right? Explicitly clear, even if you take in Ecuador, they did a commercial debt restructuring and bonded, but one of the conditions is that the IMF program is there, because the IMF program anchors it. If you look at so nobody will come to the table without it. If you look at the Annex 4, it talks about a specific time that they expect us to market access.
Right.
That anchor is useful for us, even for the whoever negotiates, to understand sort of, as you said, the broad path, the choreography you need for the debt restructuring.
Right. Thank you very much, Attorney Adla Manjuka Fananipule. I open the floor for questions from our journalists, but just a reminder, you can send in your questions on the number 076 656 5353, and we would be delighted to take those questions to the panelists tonight. So onto my immediate right is Niresh, onto my immediate left is Shania, far left is Jamal. Niresh, with your permission, shall we start off with the lady here? Yes, Shania.
Thank you, Shamir. Mr. Jafferjee, I had a question about our debt restructuring presentation that is due. It was due end of April, now we've delayed it to mid-May. What has been the progress made on the review process, and what are the implications if it's delayed again? Because I believe we're up for it in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, so this 2-week deadline is not a real deadline. It simply means that there will be a visiting delegation from the IMF. What I am told is that some announcement will be made in the month of May, that is this month. Why it has been delayed, I'm not 100% sure. But I don't envy those people who are in charge, because it's a situation of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because the general feeling of many people is, yes, we need debt restructuring, but please keep me out. So everybody says reform, restructure, but not my patch. So I think they have competing interests from various quarters lobbying how to do this. And I think there is some apprehension on some of the policymakers also of what the politics and pushback is going to come. So they are taking it very, very slow and being extremely careful. And I think when they have some kind of assurances and confidence that this will be generally accepted, they probably will come out with some plan, which invariably will also get pushback, but they will have to stick to their guns.
And would there be any implication from the other side, from the board of the IMF, for delaying?
I don't think this delay is a significant delay. I mean, it's understandable. We had so many holidays. We had the Aurudu, we had the Vesak weekend. We have a central bank bill that is going to be taken up on the 11th. The IMF agreement was presented to Parliament last week. So there's a lot going on. So it's perfectly understandable if there has been a delay.
So, Murtaza, there's a question for you from one of our viewers. So, the domestic debt sustainability is based on a multitude of factors, of which the real interest rate is a major factor. If real interest rates are less than growth rates, GDP, then our debt sustainability ratios could be as high as 95% to 125%. So, Mr. Jafferji is wrong in suggesting that the debt sustainability ratio should be around 75% to be at a sustainable level.
I think, you know, we must explain what we are dealing with. The problem in the domestic debt is not the stock, it's a flow. We are looking at the flow. Why are we looking at the flow is conceptually, I just want to get the clarity of it, is that we are trying to deal with the problem of debt overhang. That's why when I said, you see, when we are paying interest just to cover our debt, we are not investing. It's the fiscal space that we create to invest. And that is why what is important. You know, I think, you know, when I think creating a sort of a bogeyman out of this domestic debt is not helpful. The idea is that you create
it is not a boogeyman in your eyes, Manjuka, because you've not invested.
No, it's everybody's invested in it. In terms of it's a question of domestic
maybe
debt
I can
restructure is
try to answer
liquidated.
that question.
Yeah.
So the person asking the question, there is this relationship between real growth and real interest rates. So one metric of debt sustainability is to look at the debt in proportion to GDP. So if you can make GDP grow faster than your debt, then that ratio comes down. So that person's question is that the real interest rates are deeply negative because inflation has been growing at something like 50%, although for the month of April it's down to 36%. And the growth also has been negative, but the real interest rates in 2021 was far more negative than GDP growth. But that was for 1 year. That is not going to sustain going forward. So what you are going to see is that inflation is going to come down significantly because of the high base effect from last year. But GDP is not poised to grow very fast. In fact, this year also they are talking about minus 3% compression. So what that person is saying will be accurate for 2022, but not so going forward.
So, Damit, you have a question from one of us. So I'm getting a lot of questions. I'm trying to put them across to all of you as much as possible, but this is relating to your field as a banker, Damit. After the President's recent speech in Parliament on the restructuring of local debt, many bank customers who have deposits are panicked on the security of their money. Some have already started to withdraw their money. What is your opinion on this issue? Has that happened? Did you see an influx of individuals coming and withdrawing their money from banks?
No, we have not seen deposits are being taken out purely because of debt restructuring can threaten the deposits that they have parked in. I don't think it has happened. I have not seen it is happening.
Right. So I just want to ask you a question, Damit, with relating to Lebanon. I spoke to a couple of months ago. I was in the Middle East, and I was able to speak to several individuals who are from Lebanon who have settled in Kuwait, and they've said that overnight their money that they've deposited at banks vanished. The banks told them, your money is there, but we are not able to pay you. So as a result of that, your savings will be null and void at this point of time. Would something like that happen in Sri Lanka? Do you envisage something of that sort happening in Sri Lanka anytime soon?
As it is now, it is not. But I'll explain why I'm telling that. Now, if you
But there is a threat. Is that what you're trying to say?
No. As of now,
the banking system in Sri Lanka is very stable.
I would say it is stressed. So if we put further stress, it can come close to the red lines, right? But what I'm saying, if you look at the capital structures of banks,
just want to clarify this. Now, when you say stressed,
let me explain, Shari, right? So if you look at the capital structure of banks, as of now, the banks operate within the regulatory limits, meaning there is a buffer that we have versus the minimum regulatory limit that we want to maintain. Meaning that it can absorb some of the real losses in case if that impairments or provisions, whatever, that will kick in. At the same time, not only the capital, liquidity also something that we need to manage, because your question related to deposits, the people will not be able to draw the money out because of the banks not having the liquidity. So that is also something that we need to manage. So as of now, if you see the system,
because a lot of people, Damit, say banks are stressed and all that, but when you look at the amount of bonuses they are paying the employees, it doesn't reflect that, unfortunately. So when Ranil Wickremesinghe says that the banks are trying to tell me how to run a country, we have to side with the president, don't you think?
I don't think banks are telling how to run the country.
No, this is not what I'm saying, Damit. Don't get me wrong. This is what the president is saying. He is saying that if you all are telling him that the country's economy is bad, come and run the country's economy. Are you willing to do that?
So let me put it this way, Shami, right? So think of a situation where banks stop lending. Banks have stressed, no capital, nobody has come and put additional capital infused into the system.
And no one borrows because the interest rates are high.
That's right, but depositors getting benefited because they're getting the higher rate. So there is always two sides to this,
coin.
Right?
Yes, yeah.
Right? So then what happens? So even if the debt restructuring happens, so all those who get whatever haircuts or maturity extensions or reprofile want their debt paid at some point of time. To do that, the economy needs to function. So one of the mechanisms that helps economy to function is the banking system, which facilitate the businesses to grow, sustain, and
So I'm having a lot of questions coming in from Murtaza and Damit for the moment. Probably.
If I can interject, because it's very important that I clarify that Lebanese analogy. What happened in Lebanon is most of the banking system is dollarized. The people kept their money in dollars with Lebanese banks. The Lebanese banks in turn lent it to the central bank in terms of swaps. Central bank used all the dollars basically. So when the banks wanted their dollars back, the central bank didn't have dollars. But in the case of Sri Lanka, only about 20% of the assets of the banking system are in hard currency. 80% is in local currency. The central bank will act as the lender of last resort. As Damit says, it's the liquidity that is an issue. And as a bank of last resort, the central bank can provide the liquidity to any bank in case there are depositors who want to withdraw it and they don't have sufficient liquidity to provide the money. So that analogy of this happening in Lebanon and it could happen to Sri Lanka is not relevant.
It won't come into play.
I mean, it's because we don't have a dollarized banking system. We have rupees. The central bank, as a banker,
the government can print money and give it to the people.
They are the bank of last resort. That is why they are called a central bank. So any institution under their supervision, they can provide the liquidity.
I think I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
If you look at the IMF report, it allows for 6% of GDP to recapitalize the bank. So what is, you see, the debt restructure is something by fiat. It's a negotiated process. If you take the Ghana's negotiation, they had a negotiation. They sort of had a conversation with the banks. and they gave a menu of options to the banks. So what is important is ensure the last thing that anybody wants is the bank run. You have to communicate to people, build confidence with people, and manage liquidity. And so
what the president is doing is not helping.
Well, the president, I'm not sure, but the president, IMF is here. The IMF will, last thing during a ongoing program, see a run on a failure of a banking system. I don't think that's not in anybody's interest for their interest. So the banks, that Sri Lanka has advisors here, the IMF program is here. Mind you, in Lebanon, there is no IMF program. The problem, because geopolitics has prevented Lebanon from doing that.
No, but IMF, Lebanon has gone to the IMF.
Well, it has got a staff level that the government has not bought into it, and it is there. That is the problem. In fact, in a way, Lebanon is fortunate than Sri Lanka because there are many players who want to give money if the Hezbollah, but only the problem is the government, because my understanding is that the Hezbollah, the factions are preventing.
We will talk about geopolitics in a
But Shamir,
I think drawing analogies like Lebanon, like that, creating that environment is not helpful. It is matter of this is a matter of negotiations. Understand nobody. I know I've been interacted with some of the bondholders, the law advisors. The last things that they would like to see, because they only would say blood on the streets.
Yeah, so the reason that we are posing all these questions for information is why? Because the people have deposited their hard-earned money at the end of the day. For an individual of your caliber, 100,000 may not be a lot of money, but for someone who's in the grassroots, who
but 100,000 will be covered by deposit insurance.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. If they want to go to the treasury bills, that stake, they will borrow some money. They will go to the banks. They will invest their money. So it's very important for them to make sure that the money is safe at the end.
I think it will be.
Shamir, I think it's important
to making banking unsafe. Yeah. I think it's very important. This concept is that's what I said. We should be careful in what we say about banks. Saying the banks are going to fall, banks are going to do this. I think nobody wants that. It's just that when I said that what we are trying to achieve is fiscal space for growth. Because there's too much overburden. That's what we're trying to do. And nobody is talking about bank runs, banking. There are plenty of, even the government, if you see,
so
has asked for the World Bank 150 million to
saying the banks are stressed.
No, but I think the words, terminology used even public communicating about this should be careful. It's my humble opinion. I don't think even Ms. Palavata has. I have fully confidence that HMB would have, and the government, if
you are entitled for your own opinions. So,
so Shamir, let me also explain. Now, when you say the banks are stressed, so I don't think we need to bring the the conversation of whether the depositors have enough confidence in the system to pull that money out.
Relating to that, Damit. So you can probably add to that as well. If banks have to take a haircut on their exposure to the government, will it affect the principle of depositors by way of a haircut who have FDs with banks, or only affect bank reserves?
So at the moment, our conversation on the debt negotiations is that, given the statutory requirement of banks going and putting money on the government securities, so there has to be a different treatment for banks. And it is depositors' money that we have gone and put in the government securities. And also, I need to touch on that 6% of GDP recapitalization requirement, which comes to about 4.5 billion if you take the numbers. What is it that we are looking at? The banks, at the moment, if you look at the composition of the capital, there are multiple stakeholders. There are multilaterals, there are, government is part of it, corporates are part of it, individuals. So a bank going down or the system run is completely detrimental to what is happening now. So we need to make sure whatever the restructuring we are doing, so we need to have a pathway. How do we service the restructured debt? You can't kill the way that how you service the restructured debt by doing a debt restructuring. Right. So
Mr. Palavata, I want to talk to you, since in your opening remarks you mentioned about the government of Sri Lanka and the relationships they have with banks in the country. You said that banks at times, to their own detriment, have given moratoriums to borrowers. So at a time like that, I saw recently that the Sri Lanka Banks Association had released a press statement saying that there is a lack of transparency that has been between the communication from the government of Sri Lanka towards banks. And they have also mentioned that there could be an impact on the banking sector capital and liquidity if domestic debt restructuring is to come about in the future. So can you just explain to me how vital the relationship and the synergy between the banking sector in the country and the government of Sri Lanka is in terms of achieving overall economic revival, which is the bigger picture, because we are all debating ultimately for the country's economy to be revived and to go towards a growth path. So can you explain to me how vital that relationship is and what can be done for those two entities to forge that relationship so that it benefits the country as a whole?
And also, what is the consultative process that has been happening, or we assume has happened, between the government and the banks over the past several months? Because we assume that there has been such a process, which it doesn't appear it has gone very well, judging by the remarks of the President about our banking sector. So if you could tell us how that, the nitty-gritty of how it works. Do you all have meetings with the central bank, with the finance ministry? How does it work?
So let me come to that. I'll first take Jayamal's question. I think excellent question. So that is something, that is a question that we need to focus on. How does the banking system help revival of the economy, right? When the East attack hit and when the COVID closed the economies, how did this country's economy survive, right? What is that facilitation? It has come from the banks at cost, which banks got hit on their either balance sheet or the P&L. So how does that impact the revival? So the business to happen, there has to be increase in the private sector credit. If you see over the past so many months, credit to private sector has dropped, meaning it does not stimulate the economy to make that the production economy or the export economy that we need to, we are envisaging for. So that is what we need to. Now we are all talking about the debt restructuring. Yeah. So other side of the debt restructuring is how do we increase the revenue? So to repay the debt, you need to have revenue. So we speak of export drives, how do we drive exports incremental? We talk about import substitution. We talk about SOE reforms. And, there are some conversation about broadening the tax net. So all that will adjust this other side of this debt restructuring. That helps economic revival. So that happens through the process of economic revival. So as you said, the banks play a key role in facilitating that. So we have, if you remember, over the last 2-3 years, we would have given life to so many businesses, otherwise we would have gone under, right? So that creates jobs, that flows the money into the economy, create that production economy that we are looking at. So then it's vital. So we align ourselves to the economic revival. So if the government is pushing the agenda that we need to revive the economy to support the other side of the coin, which is a revenue generation, I think banks are a must stakeholder facilitating that. So banks are doing it and willing to do it and continue to do it. There is no question about it.
Stakeholder consultations with this.
So stakeholder consultation, I think the banks have made a consortium. So specifically with regard to this debt restructuring, to have supported by the Bankers Association, they have continuous dialogue with the central bank and the government. So the recent statement, I think if you have read it, it's very clear. There were some concerns expressed if you do the restructuring which can impact the capital levels of the bank, which result in an infusion of capital, there can be adverse impacts which can scroll down to the economy, which impact the revival. So some of the questions that raised, what is that word voluntary means? How does that kind of implemented in the whole thing? Maybe Murtaza can shed some light on that.
So, Dr. Kanshamurthy, you as an individual, would you go to the extent of depositing your money at banks now, given the current situation in the country?
To answer your question, I would like to give an example of a recent bank run. The Credit Suisse Bank
Which collapsed in the US.
collapsed in Switzerland.
In Switzerland, yes.
Yes.
Credit
And
Suisse, yes.
and the news report read, I quote, collapse came after customers worried about safety of their funds, withdraw their money en masse. Which means this is run by panic situation. When there is an uncertainty that create panic situation and also a lot of speculation, right? And we, from this discussion, the viewers might have got a clear understanding about Sri Lankan banking sector is very stable, right? But at the same time, depositors will look at whether my deposit is safer. EPF, ETF people, the workers might think whether I will get a lesser ETF or my ETF will be cut. These are the two questions for the common man's perception or looks at. As a common man, I would see whether my deposit, if I deposit it, whether my deposit is safer with the given interest rate. Will I get at my maturity period? Or if I have a kind of a fixed deposit, whether that obligation is honored by the bank. Will I get a lesser because of this? So restructuring or debt restructuring or whatever it is nothing to do with the people. They don't worry about it. So if they feel that, okay, Sri Lankan banking sector is safer, our EPF, ETF are safer, you're fine, you can do the debt restructuring without any problem. But when there is an uncertainty created, when there is a panic situation arise, when there is a speculation rise, any bank or any institution can collapse. I gave an example with a stable banking sector. The example for banking sector, Swiss bank is the well-known example, right? So even in Switzerland, a bank can collapse because of the bank run, the people withdraw their money in large number because they didn't believe, because there was a panic
Manjik,
situation.
what do you have to say about that?
Well, with the analogy of, I won't say that this Credit Suisse collapsed, just taken over by another UBS. So there was no sort of people on the street hammering on MTM to take. In fact, if you take, we were all surprised, markets are surprised that Credit Suisse is financing Ecuador's debt-to-nature swap and 800 million. So there is money in, we should not talk, we talk of ideas and jargon is in extreme firms. I do not think that we should, so any regulator, if you look what happened there, regulator stepped in, gave another bank, and they ensured that everybody obligations are met. There was obviously, even today, if you take a bank, if somebody starts causing panic, a bank can collapse any day because bank is cannot always meet its obligations at once. So I do not think the idea of creating an idea of bank run is wrong. What is, I think, would happen is that be discussion with the government and the creditors as to how you can create the fiscal space. Secondly, the government will look at, as Murtaza said, government will also provide liquidity support, and the IMF would step in to advise the government to do that. Third option, if you look at the IMF report, they will also create, where the extreme situations are there, they will create what you call a bank resolution process, a bank sort of, so that you can go and get, if there is a situation the bank is collapsed, you can have a moratorium, you can sort out the matters, give capitalization, and come out of the process. That is the process of debt restructuring. There is no sort of tomorrow you are not going to pay your debt. That is not what anybody is going to do. Why you have a debt restructure is it's a negotiated, methodical process. What is needed in a debt restructure is communication and transparency. So you do it, and ultimately there's a report. Everybody knows what is it, and that is what it needs to be done. I think communications, confidence building is important, and everybody works in synchrony.
So, Mr. Jafarji, I want to come back to the topic of domestic debt optimization. That's what the central bank has called it. During the presentation to the creditors, it was mentioned that DDO will only be done based on a voluntary basis. So, against such a backdrop, let's take a look at the flip side of it. If there is a voluntary side to this DDO, is there a mandatory element, or who will it apply to? Will it apply to major T-bond or T-bill holders like superannuation funds, pension funds, state-owned banks? So what is the flip side of it? Because we only hear the voluntary element of it. What is the mandatory element? Is there a mandatory element?
So I've also been wondering what this word voluntary means. And whenever I've got the opportunity, I have asked what does voluntary mean, because it doesn't make sense of anybody volunteering. But let me explain to you what mandatory means. So mandatory means that most of these securities have been issued under Sri Lanka law. So you can change the law in Parliament saying that all bonds, and generally bills are not restructured, or it's not your first priority, that you swap one set of bonds for another set of bonds. Right? So that's what mandatory means, and you can just change the law and pass a new law and say that from this point onwards, like you can do demonetization, saying that this 1,000 rupee note is no longer valid. It will be replaced with another 1,000 rupee note. You can replace one set of bonds with another set of bonds. Of course, the new set of bonds will have different terms. So that is what mandatory means. Now, what you might have in between, and they also say in that document, no coercion, but you may have different treatment for old bonds and new bonds. So they take a stick and carrot approach. So for example, those who hang on to the old bonds cannot get liquidity support from the central bank. So you can't repo for liquidity purposes. And these instruments are held by banks because as per the Banking Act, 20% of interest-bearing liabilities have to be held by liquid securities. And sovereign issuances are considered liquid securities. So if you are going to sit on a bond that does not have access to the same liquidity support, then it's not a very desirable instrument. They could also turn around and say that there is something called capital adequacy computations. And lending to the sovereign is zero risk rated. So they can turn around and say that the old bonds, we will not allow you to zero risk weight it, and we will make you risk weight it at 100%, 150%. So then you have to put more capital to hold those instruments. So from a capital efficiency perspective, it is not optimal. So there could be different tax treatments, that the old set of bonds have different rates of taxes. So there could be number of sticks and carrots that could be used to kind of nudge people
to lure them
towards
into
going for the alternate thing.
I see.
So that's all part of the policy space, and we don't know what they have in mind. They also can treat different institutions differently based on the ability to sustain the debt restructuring or reprofiling. My personal view is I don't agree with that. And we could discuss that if there is time, of who owns these bonds and who can adjust these things. Because ultimately a rupee is a rupee, and we must treat all rupees equally.
I mean, if I can share something, in Jamaica, most countries that did the domestic restructure, they took bank by bank, right, and balance sheet by balance sheet. And once they came to a conclusion, I think the debt documents, that there is already a process that is going on. But
is that what's going on? Is
that's something that I think they're going on at the moment. But my conversation with people who have done this before, it needs a bit more intensive. You need to look at very microscopically each bank. And then you come up with a menu of, say, if you have a certain bond, 2 or 3 bonds on offer, so you have a menu that will fit the particular type, will have buy-ins, and that will help to manage the process. So you don't sort of give a all fit one answer to this. You try to get menu of, say, you can have some people maybe will take a little bit more, so you create a bond that is for that nature. You have so you create a conversation with the bondholders, with the central bank and the negotiations to come up with a menu. And then you probably look at it. I mean, Ghana did not at the first, so Ghana has gone through 2 rounds. So the first round, they kept out the, what you call the pension funds out, and they got the banks in and others in. So they got in. They are going for a second round now, and their speculation is that then with the pensions may come in. But you look at sort of that sort of menu. You don't. This is not a very say that tomorrow I'm going to say the banks have reduced half the portfolio extension for 10 years, everything, all the bonds. I think it's more of a much more conversation, dialogue approach they will take to this.
But that option that Manjuka is talking is a bad example of how people did it. I don't think Sri Lanka should go down that route just because other people did it, because then you're picking winners and losers, and then it is very subjective.
No, I mean, Nutsa, I mean, you've misunderstood what nobody's keeping anybody out. What you do is you create everybody in. You get a buy-in from everybody, but the instrument menu is different. That's all you do. So nobody's leaving anybody out. You don't need to keep, because unlike the external side, comparability is an issue. When it's the domestic side, you don't need comparability. That's how it's looked at. Because what is more important is sustaining the banking system and liquidity, and not a collapse of the economy. So you would create menu of instruments to fit the bill. That's what I'm saying.
Do you agree with that, Murtaza?
No. So basically, the question is that you can say that it has the same impact, but some instruments will have longer maturity, some will have an adjustment to the coupon. The question is, it's all very, very subjective, because we can come to this whole banking issue, which I have a slightly different opinion. I think there is more fear than reality in this whole restructuring, because it's about your concern and what you've been focusing on, whether the depositors will be impacted. But long before the depositors, there are capital cushions that can absorb a lot of the loss. And by the time these capital cushions get exhausted, you have tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital, you are expecting then a very, very severe crisis, which I don't think it will come to.
To that,
you can precipitate that if you make huge policy missteps. These things that it's self-reinforcing.
And you don't envisage such policy missteps to happen.
If you do it very carefully and clinically, and you spread the pain over a larger base, the pain any one entity will have to take is going to be bearable, not unbearable.
So,
of course, somebody is going to lose out.
Lose out at the end of the day.
And it will be more likely shareholders in the case of banks, or some of the debenture holders.
Someone has to take
but
the brunt
not necessarily depositors.
So I'm getting a lot of questions today on the show because of the knowledge that the 4 panelists are having on this subject. So the question is directed at Murtaza now. The main reason for the downward adjustment of our economy is due to the exchange rate overshoot that took place in May 2022. It is not what Murtaza is suggesting, wherein he indicated that debt sustainability was the underlying factor.
So the question they are asking is, the exchange rate created the crisis?
What he's saying is, it was the exchange rate overshoot that took place in May 2022, which created the downward adjustment of the country's economy, and not the underlying factor when it comes to debt sustainability.
So the exchange rate was a symptom, right? It was not a causal factor. So what happened is that in the year 2020 and 2021, you kept interest rates at artificially low level. You had record amount of credit growth. You kept through moral suasion, you kept the exchange rate at an artificially low 200 rupees. You continue to use all your reserves to pay some of the ISP holders. So you exhausted your reserves, and then you allowed the pressure to build, and you didn't revise the price of electricity, you didn't revise the price of diesel, you didn't revise the price of petrol. So I can show you, if I had my chart book, the amount of excess demand that was going on in the economy, especially in the year 2021. And as a banker, you can ask Amit about how much a demand there was for imports, etc. So there came a point when we started running out of dollars and there was scarcity, etc. So it was like the pressure was building and building, and came April, and when you let it go, they sequenced it wrong. That they let the currency go. They should have taken other steps before.
To manage it better.
They should have taken other active steps to slow the demand, like increasing interest rates, put in certain import controls, etc., and finally let exchange rate go. Then you wouldn't have got such an overshoot. So what did happen is that when you allowed all this pressure to build and let go, it just exploded. And that is where you had such a massive adjustment of something like over 70%, 80%. And then when the contraction came, the currency appreciated again to 320. So we don't know what the market level is going to be.
What is going to be the market level in 2023?
So we don't know, Shamir. I honestly don't know, because we don't have a liberalized market. You still have import controls. We haven't been allowed cars for the last 3 years, right? And a lot of the firms had excess amount of inventory going into this current crisis. So their imports have double come down. It's not only a contraction of demand. So for example, things like cement are down 50%. Discretionary items are down 25 to 30%. Construction is the worst
affected.
Right? So first they have to run down their inventories, which is probably done now, and you see the import demand slowly coming back. So we will probably know what the most stable rate is towards the end of the year.
So Damit, with regard to these depositors, we have a question for you. What is the position of the depositors who have invested in wealth co-subsidiaries of banks? They've mentioned a few banks, but because the representatives are not there on the show tonight, I'm not going to mention that. But they've also mentioned HNB Finance in comparison to banks.
So let me put it this way. Now, to hit the impact to depositors, there are multiple layers. I think Murtaza very
clearly articulated that. Yes.
So the capital buffers that they have.
Is the shareholders going to be affected first?
First, it's going to be the capital buffer that gets absorbed, and then it will trickle down. But I don't see at the moment there is a risk on any depositor getting hit simply because they have invested in a, the institution has invested in a government security which is subject to debt restructuring.
So there was a time, Damit, that when you go to some of these wealth co subsidiaries, they came up and told some depositors who were investing on fixed deposits that they were not reinvesting in treasury bills or treasury bonds, and that is why their interest rates were much lower than interest rates of other institutions. Is that an argument that can be bought by a depositor?
So that is pure speculation, right? So like now, because of the announcement of district debt restructuring has not done, there are so many opinions and views expressed. Similarly, from time to time, with regard to bills and bonds, those speculations have come across. So some institution has decided, I'm not going to invest in treasury bills or bonds. So then if they don't have that option to invest in bills and bonds carrying that amount of yield, what are they going to do with the money? So they can't give that return to the depositor.
No, but if you look at the banking sector, Damit, now I've invested my money at several international banks operating in Sri Lanka. The interest rates that are being yielded on those deposits are much lower than the interest rates that are offered by local banks. If you look at the international banks that are operating, their fixed deposit rates are going at approximately around 4% to 9%, whereas the local banks in Sri Lanka offers an interest rate of 24% and 26%. Why is that?
There is a reason. So the local banks, so when you raise the deposits, if you can't deploy that in the loans, which is the case, past maybe year or so, because there is a very low demand for credit. So where do we deploy the funds? So we deploy in treasury bills and bonds. Right? So mainly treasury bills because it's short term, we can manage.
So if the government takes that haircut or reprofiling or maturity extensions that was spoken about on this show a couple of minutes ago, how would that impact the depositor?
So I think before coming to the depositor, I'm reiterating, Shamir, because if you bring the depositor into the conversation of debt restructuring, I think it's little far-sighted, and it is, probably out of the circle that we would, need to take this conversation.
So people don't have to worry yet.
The depositors don't have to worry about it.
Right? Can we also look at the superannuation funds, EPF, ETF, and private pension funds? What could be the impact on them? We've been talking about the banks quite a bit. What about the EPF?
So I would prefer to refrain within the banking
Certainly.
probably.
Can I address that to Dr. Ganeshamurthy?
Well, EPF, ETF also may be having certain safeguards up to certain level in order to cushion this if there is a negative impact. But as you all, I also having a serious doubt about what is going to happen on the EPF. But His Excellency the President in the parliamentary address, he mentioned briefly that we have created the EPF and there won't be any impact on the EPF. So we'll believe in that.
But in the past, there have been dubious instances where the EPF's investments in the stock market were called into question. Again, that's not exactly comforting.
True enough. But none of the EPF holders, those who have got retired, did not face any difficulties in getting their funds.
Dr. Ganeshamurthy, now I was of the opinion the government has stopped paying their loans.
Yeah.
I was of that opinion. I thought the government has stopped paying their loans. But a few days ago, there was news saying that the government had paid a loan to the Indian government.
Yes. With the
How did that happen?
IMF funding, they have to repay a part of the loans because that is not an actually loan. It's a repayment through the Asian clearance. So it's due. It was pending for quite a
Did
long
India
time.
ask for that money?
No, that is the support given by the Indian government to clear some funds through the Asian Clearance Union. They have postponed that clearance.
But I was always of the opinion that multilateral donors like IMF, World Bank, and EDB or ADB for that matter, those loans have to be repaid even though the government declares bankruptcy. But such loans can wait, isn't it?
There is this is what is called trade finance. Yeah. Trade finance loans are like importing with every day. Those also kept out of the debt perimeter, the restructuring perimeters. So if you look at anything, they normally don't restructure because that's the money you need for everyday living of the country, right? So then multilateral debt payments, for example, why you don't restructure them is that it values the AAA status they have, and they can borrow from the market and give at cheaper rates to the country. That's the reason the rationality of multilateral debt been excluded. So two aspects, the ACU in Asian Clearance Union is basically trade credit been and fact that we did not pay our trade credit would have been a big problem.
Can I, Shamit, there's an important clarification here I want to make, right? So what is this Asian Clearing Union? So there are about 7 countries. It's actually headquartered in Tehran. All the SAARC countries are pretty much there. And most of the trade between these SAARC countries, when an exporter and importer trade, the central banks settle every 2 months amongst themselves. So we have a large trade deficit to India. So we had our central bank had large amount of money owed to the Reserve Bank of India. And when this crisis was brewing towards the end of 2021 and for the first half of 2022, under the exceptional support given by the Indian government, the Reserve Bank allowed us time to pay those owed money. So that got postponed and postponed. Now that was not given to the government of Sri Lanka. It was a credit given to the central bank. So it is the central bank that is extinguishing some of its liabilities if it has settled some of those ACU payments, right? The other thing, if you permit me, which is very, very important that I have to explain, is about accounting. You know, your viewers should understand about these losses, etc., and how banks work. So what banks do is that they mobilize deposits which are more short term at a particular interest rate, and they add a net interest margin to mobilize money and relend it. So in the case of securities, government securities, they account it under a certain bucket called amortized cost. So if there is some kind of restructuring, you may have to revalue them at what is called fair value. And when you value these new bonds, the problem is that because of the extreme uncertainty that is happening in the interest rate market, the interest rates at which government securities are issued at are abnormally high, unjustifiably high, because government securities are considered risk-free. So the policy interest rates of the central bank are 16.5%, and these securities are being issued at about 22%, 23%. So what explains that huge divergence between policy interest rates? It should normally be of the nature of 0.5% to 1%, but it is now about 6%. So the fear of some kind of restructuring is imposing a very high credit risk premium on what is normally considered a risk-free security, right? So the two things are endogenous, that means they're interlinked.
So you're saying that come the next few weeks?
No, let's say that with inflation coming down and the fact that if a domestic restructuring is announced and that credit risk premium goes away, the market interest rates will significantly come down. So even if you were to adjust the coupons on some of these very high coupon yielding securities and extend the maturities, the deposit interest rates will also come down significantly.
So the theory
So
is,
then,
yeah.
if I may finish,
Yeah.
they can easily manage the situation. So the problem here is when you readjust with a debt restructuring, how you are going to value, and that is in the realms of accounting. And there may be some kind of regulatory relaxation, etc., that can be done to avoid what is called a day one loss, because it will be ridiculous to try to revalue these new bonds at 22% interest rate, because then the value will come down significantly.
So Mursa, when do you see the policy interest rates coming down and a readjustment taking place?
So there are two. No, one is this huge credit risk. So that is mainly due to the fear of a domestic debt restructuring. And
that's fair for the.
Yeah, it is fair,
It's
because
fair. That's how
the
market
person who is
sentiments
getting
work.
22% is being told that you may not get 22% if there's a restructuring. Fair enough. I mean, that's the market signaling. As far as the policy interest rates are concerned, it's all tied to inflation. So we saw that April inflation, which was announced last Friday, the rate had come down from something like 50% to 36% for the Colombo Consumer Price Index. And since the crisis started last April 2022, you had month-on-month large increases till about July 2022. So when we go forward in 3 to 4 months, the high base effect coming from last year is going to reduce significantly the year-on-year inflation. And therefore, I would guess that towards the end of the year, you're going to have single-digit inflation, which will give significant amount of room for the central bank to cut interest rates.
So you're saying that single-digit interest rates,
Single-digit inflation.
Inflation rates are possible in the next
So
few months?
between March and April, based on the Colombo Consumer Price Index, month on month, the index came down by 1.5%. So the trend clearly, with energy prices globally coming down, Brent crude is at $75 today. All the indications are that those extreme situations that existed, with a bit of luck, if the weather turns against us, Shamir, because it is expected that El Nino year will set in from the second half of this year, which is not very good for Sri Lanka, the trend is very clear with so much of demand contraction. And if you ask Damit, he's head of corporate banking, the demand for credit is very low. So when an economy is contracting, inflation will automatically come down, because there is less money chasing more goods.
So the government may even look at reducing the tax rates, pay tax rates in the future as well.
No, well, you can keep hoping. I think that will be a very, very bad move, although there may be some case for adjustment of some of those bans.
Bans, okay. So Mursa, you are also part of a stock brokering firm. And if I don't ask this question from you today, I'll probably be failing in my duties as a journalist. When you heard President Ranil Wickremesinghe saying that he would close down the stock market, didn't jitters run down your spine?
So, time to time, he has made certain pronouncements. I don't think he means it literally.
He doesn't mean. He just
I don't think he means it literally.
So we shouldn't take him that seriously.
I mean, some element of humor is permitted.
In Parliament?
Well, there's a lot of things said that, has a different context. So I won't be reading too much into that statement that he made.
He seemed more angry than
Probably.
hilarious.
So I was wondering who he saw in the audience.
Yeah, I didn't see a grin on his face when he said that.
Absolutely
He was very angry.
Very angry, yes.
So as I said, that I won't read too much into that comment.
So we are getting a lot of questions today, Damit, relating to people's deposits. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm going to take these questions up because most of the people who are watching the show tonight want to know what's going to happen to their deposits. I know you were very clear alongside with Murtaza, depositors need not worry. So one of the questions was, Fitch Ratings have downgraded most of the Sri Lankan banks at the moment. What sort of impact would it create in the next few months, next few years, as far as the banking system in Sri Lanka is concerned?
So, interesting question. Why Fitch has downgraded? So, if you read each of the reports, you would have seen one of the reasons why they have downgraded. They can't give a rating better than the country rating for institution within. When the country is rated default, they can't do an institution within that country better than that rating. So, impact is when you do transaction with a bank overseas. So, our ability to negotiate that transaction and enter into transaction is much less because their own probably the risk departments or whoever have restricted their limits or cut the limits down so they can't transact with the country or institution which has a rating close to default. Right. So that has been having a lot of challenges. There were things that we have done. That also you need to know actually. When at the height of this default, banks still supported transaction with overseas counterparts. So we got the support of the organizations like ADB which guaranteed some of the transactions the local bank did and supported the counterparty on the other end so the transaction can flow through. It would have been costly, but still the transaction happened. So those challenges will continue until the rating is reinstated.
Dr. Ganesh Murthy, do you agree with Murtaza when he says that inflation is going to come to single digits in the next few months? Because if you look at the consumer spending is a little bit low.
Yeah,
and we know that when consumer spending is a bit low, inflation coming down to single digits is going to be a far reality, isn't it?
No, I looked at it in a different way because I don't believe that the inflation figures from the local institutions. Always there are issues and problems. Even at the international level, inflation rate, which is calculated by Professor Hankey, it has come down. It has come down, but not drastic as the local inflation for the month of
If I'm not mistaken, Professor Hankey suggested the Sri Lankan inflation rate is going to go up by around 157% at one point as well.
Yeah, that's right. It has come down to less than 50% right now. So we can see there is a downward trend in the inflation rate. But I have serious doubt when it happened in the single digit toward the end of the month, end of the year. But anyway, the downward trend is visible.
But Dr. Ganesh Murthy, to give it to the government, there seems to be somewhat of some development, isn't it? Now, petrol prices, diesel prices went down by 135 rupees and people are happy. So, shouldn't they be happy? Because you always seem very skeptic about the country's economy. Be a little bit optimistic.
Well, people are very much comfortable now because the petrol is available and the petrol price is going down.
Now 30 liters.
Yeah,
not bad.
Yeah, not bad. Yeah. But the economy is already shrunk. Economy is on the downward.
Why are you so skeptic? Don't you like President Ranil Singh's policies?
No, I am not subscribing to any particular policy. If the policy is going through a right direction, I always praise it. But when you see this, there's a doubt or there's a skeptic, then there should be expressed that skepticism. You don't necessarily always.
But look at the country's economy now, Dr. Ganesh Murthy. Petrol prices have come down. As Murtaza says, inflation is going to come down to single digits. All good news. Now, this is what the people want. Now, my question is, just imagine when the government starts paying the loans back, then what's going to happen?
Yeah, because we have a demand contraction, serious demand contraction, and also we have a contraction in the overall economy. So inflation naturally comes down, but this doesn't mean that the economy is doing good. When we need to see expansion of the economy. Then
Murthy, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, so what basically, inflation coming down means demand is lower than supply, right? So which means that the quality of life of most of the people have significantly gone down. 1/3 of the people, the World Food Organization has estimated has a protein deficiency. So even though inflation will come down, the whole price went up, that people's real incomes have significantly diminished. So it's just that things are not getting worse, but it's not improving. That's a different matter. They are going back to where they came from.
So, consumer, do you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, from my perspective, what you must also realize that there's a concerted effort internationally to bring inflation. Inflation is a problem everywhere. So when you look at
across the world.
So
yeah,
I think if you look at most countries, even that's why interest rates have been hiked so much. So interest rates hike means you contract demand. Even internationally, if you look at what is happening in the oil markets, the government, everybody's worried about U.S. recession, and everybody's has. So it's something not really I won't attribute wholly to the government of Sri Lanka. And even if you talk about inflation rates coming up with single digits, it means that a fair amount of inflation has already taken the real prices down. And as Murthy said, we have real economy, real incomes have come down, and that has not been replaced. I mean, if you look at this contextualize this entire IMF program. If you look at what we are trying to achieve, we are trying to look at the GDP numbers in 2019 in 2027. That's what the IMF program is about. An IMF program is only about creating stability and is not really looking at growth. Growth is 3%. Their predicted growth for most of the program period is 3%. So yes, inflation, because to create stability, inflation will come down. But I don't know the recovery of real income in that period it has to require questions.
So, Damayanti, in a nutshell, what you're trying to say alongside with Murtaza is the fact that people need not worry at this point of time, is it?
That's right.
The government has taken corrective actions to get the course right in terms of the country's economy. Is that so?
We see some positive side, Shamil, because you could see what has happened so far. So you will see some right policies have been.
You're not as skeptic as Dr. Ganeshamurthy.
So it's like this, you need to believe what you are seeing, right? We have seen some positive movements, and that's why even on the subject that we are talking on the debt restructuring, right? So we don't want to disrupt that whole thing, the positive momentum. We need to do it with the least possible adverse impact. So we need to continue. The key is economic revival. So whatever it is, even though do you restructure, you have to pay back.
So yeah.
Where do we go into?
So Murthy, I always ask you political questions. Fortunately, unfortunately, I'm going to ask you another political question. How do you think Ranil Wickremesinghe is managing the country's economy as the Minister of Finance?
So the first thing is that I've had some interactions with him.
You've not advised him?
No. So this is over maybe 10 years. He's an individual who believes in markets. And my fundamental premise has been that Sri Lanka got into trouble not necessarily due to misappropriation, which is what the general public feel that a person or two people robbed the country. But it was more due to misallocation and mismanagement. Misallocation being the main causal factor. And what I mean by misallocation is that resources are scarce and prices signal the scarcity value of a resource. So in a market economy, the allocation of resources are driven by the signals that prices give. So the current president is a believer in the market economy, and he has very clearly said that his economic ideology is a highly competitive social market economy. I'm a believer in the social market economy because that is a German system which requires the economy to operate on market principles but there is an element of welfareism through a provision of public services like health and education, and to the very needy cash-based transfers. But you've got to have a lot of competition, and you must allow capitalism to thrive, not what we had, which was crony capitalism. So he is basically trying to push that direction, but he has an unenviable task because the challenge is enormous. We have lost a lot of our talent because of the brain drain. There are very few people who have the capability to implement all the reform necessary, and it is going to take a lot longer than people's own timelines. And that is where there will have to be some patience. But one of his probable weaknesses is a lot of the good reform ideas that he even had in 2002, which they are implementing now, for some reason doesn't get communicated to the people. So there is always a hijacking of the narrative, and people come up with all sorts of crazy theories and conspiracy theories and confuse the people.
So are you happy with the performance of Ranil Wickremesinghe as the Minister of Finance?
So my premise is that he should not be the finance minister, that we should have a full-time finance minister, and I have spoken about that.
Yes, I want to drag your attention to the on the 24th annual tax oration of the Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka. You go on to say, it is a responsibility of the finance minister to work towards increasing income while simultaneously reducing expenditure. Since this would make him or her unpopular with both his party and the public, it cannot be carried out by the head of state. You're talking about the Minister of Finance. So you still are of the same opinion.
Yeah, I said that and have said that many times, that if you look at it over the last 20 odd years, either the President or Prime Minister has been the Finance Minister. And in my opinion, the Finance Minister basically is a full-time job, and he cannot be the party leader or the head of state because it's a very unpopular job. You're trying to tax the people, or you're trying to cut down expenditure, and therefore he should not be the finance minister. But having said that, he kind of understands what needs to be done. So it's great to have an individual like that who gets it, who understands. But perhaps an individual needs to come who can focus on that job full time, because it's an extremely difficult and strenuous job. And maybe somebody younger should come in.
Are you trying to say that President Ranil Wickremesinghe was too old to hold the post of finance minister?
The reality is that he is in his 70s, and he has a lot of stuff on his plate. But it would be nice to have somebody a bit younger who can focus on the job full time.
Right.
I think he also probably is agreeable to that if he can find a suitable candidate.
So he won't find a suitable candidate in this parliament?
I don't know. I'm just assuming.
So he should go for an election?
That I don't know.
So I want to pick the brain of all four of you. With regard to the country's economy, we spoke about domestic debt restructuring in length. I want to take one step back and look at the country's economy as a whole. The next few months, how tough is it going to be? The question that the people are having at the moment is, are we going to deposit money at the banks, or are we going to buy real estate, for an example? That's one of the questions that was posed by one of our viewers today as well. Where must I invest my money? If I have to double my money in the next few months, what steps should I take? Now, usually, Murtaza, coming to you and getting some advice means money, but this is a platform that people could probably get your insight and input with regard to how they could earn a few extra bucks in the next few months, next few years. Damit, you're a banker, you can probably give some input with regard to that aspect as well. Dr. Ganeshamurthy, being the eternal pessimist, can shed some light with regard to whether you agree to the analogy that was made by Damit and Murtaza. And then as an attorney at law, you could say whether the money is safe wherever they're investing. So let's start off with Manjuka. With regard to
let me
the
put this perspective of this. On the EPF Act specifies that at least accounts, the money that is in the individual members' accounts cannot be reduced. That's an act. And I doubt it if a government brings a bill to reduce that, the Supreme Court will hold with the government. I would really doubt that point. Where I see it, probably the return on the EPF money they already have will come down. So I don't think that should be an issue. I don't think no government envisages or the IMF or any stakeholder in the debt restructuring, even the external debtors, will want a debt bank run. So there will be probably they will orderly process this wants to be. What is so that in that context, yes. But actually, what I would also see, I would say the debt restructuring is positive, growth positive, because you already see people coming back money into the money markets on the short end. That shows that they are confident in it. They feel that stability in interest rates, stability of exchange rates, that will be growth positive. So I don't think you will not make. This is not a process of making sort of overnight money or a speculative things. You might there may be speculative opportunities if you look for it, even in the downside of things. In even the worst economy, people made money. Making money is not a function of growth of economy. It's looking at opportunity. So that is where I put it at. But I don't think you shouldn't look at it from a perspective that you're going to lose all your money, you're going to be homeless tomorrow. From that doomsday perspective should not be looked. But I think the restructuring will bring stability, it will bring opportunity, and it will even then that's what is shown in the money coming to the treasury bill market.
So Banchuka, so this is your first show on Face the Nation. But individuals in the caliber of Murtaza, Damit, and Dr. Ganesh Murthy has been on the show a couple of times.
I'm honored to be there.
And the point that I'm trying to make is, we've been telling the government that the course that they were taking since 2019, if I'm not mistaken, Murtaza along with Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena were on the show once, and they said that the course that the government is going was wrong. And a lot of effort was taken by individuals the caliber of Murtaza, Damit, and Dr. Ganesh Murthy to put the government on track. They didn't listen. They were very arrogant in their approach. And look at where we are today. Do we deserve that? That's the question mark. Do we deserve that as individuals? Do we deserve that as the future prospects of this island nation? Look at the brain drain in the country today. It's attributed to the complete mismanagement.
Just to put this into perspective, I think a lot of people see it different. I mean, we benefited from particular policies of the government. For example, the borrowing in the ISBs help people pay less taxation. Right. So these are, it's looking at from a perspective. Where we are here is not entirely.
I think Manjuka, your memory is a little bit short-lived, because in 2019, when the people were paying taxes up to 24%, they never went and told the government to reduce it. They never went and told the government.
True.
The government took a policy decision. I recollect that week after, we had Murtaza on the show, and Murtaza said this is the worst decision the government can take.
That's correct.
And look at what transpired after that. So I respect your views.
No, because
my
view is
that's important.
What I meant.
We invite you and we want to hear what you say, and we respect your thoughts. But I just want to remind you, we Sri Lankans don't deserve this. We don't deserve this. We don't deserve to be in this position. Go to a petrol station, pump 20 liters of petrol and be satisfied with it. We shouldn't go home and start expecting that our electricity bill is going to go up by around 100%. That we shouldn't expect. That is not what this country is all about. It's completely because of mismanagement that we're in this scenario now. But that's our opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
It's
not mismanaged.
Yeah.
It's mismanaged. That's true.
So,
the 2019.
So we'll leave that. We'll leave that notion parked. I want to speak to the three gentlemen with regard to the country's economy and the way forward. So let's start off with Dr. Ganesh Murthy, and then we will wrap it up with Murtaza's thoughts.
Whether it is because of mismanagement or misappropriation, we don't know. But our neighboring countries are growing at a very fast rate, even after COVID, pandemic. So we don't deserve this kind of a situation, because this is a very beautiful country with all the resources, human resources, and we are basically sending our human resources for other countries to make use of the other countries' economy prosper. So whatever is said and done, debt restructuring would be an inevitable process at this moment, even domestic debt. But let it be very clear to everyone, and the government should announce this. This is how it's going to be, and make the confident. And whether the people trust in the government or not is a different story. But this particular aspect has to be transfer in a clear manner to the people, to make the people comfortable, and also avoid in the panic behavior of the people.
So what you're saying is basically whatever decision that's going to transpire in the next few months has to be clearly communicated to the public,
Yeah.
what their policies are.
Yeah.
But usually, Dr. Ganeshmurthy, we had Dr. Nandalal Veer Singh on the show a couple of months back prior to the domestic debt restructuring or IMF programs and all that were concerned. That he said was they don't want to bring in the news early to the public relating to any issues of this sort.
True, but that should
sends
not be,
out a panic message
that
already.
should not be too late also. Appropriate time, the message should go to the public, make them comfortable and make them trust whatever the government is going to take.
Right. So I now move my attention to Damit Palewata, Deputy General Manager at National Bank.
So, as you said, Shamir, we have burnt our fingers so many times. So, we don't want same thing happen in the debt restructuring as well. So, then one has to be careful what impacts it brings into various segments of the economy. I'm specifically talking from the point of view of the banks in supporting the revival, how and what should be done. Nevertheless, if you look at the economic revival, there are drivers that we need to push. So, what triggers those drivers, what facilitates is something that we need to be mindful. So I spoke of exports, I spoke of production economy, import substitution, then how do we broaden the tax net and the SOE reforms. All that will strengthen the revenue side of the government, which is critical if you are looking at economic revival. But you also at the same time needs to be mindful, if we agree on a debt restructuring, at some point we need to start paying the debts. So that means there has to be dollars moving out of the country. As of now, if you see in the banking system, there is excess dollar position in terms of liquidity. Every bank has excess dollars in liquidity. So what is the source of that liquidity is either you get remittances or you get export proceeds. But that excess is there because your imports are restricted and you are not making your loan repayments.
So the moment that happens, what will happen?
That's what I'm coming into. So the economic revival has to be far-sighted in that context. So no sooner you liberalize some of those imports, which has to be gradually as per the understanding that we have on the World Trade Organization. So dollars will start flowing out and we might need to pay loan installments from the day that we start the repayments on that. So then now onwards we need to understand that. So we can't come to once again situation we are tight, we can't facilitate. So the economic revival what you are talking has multiple aspects. It's multifaceted actually.
We shouldn't go back to square one.
Yes. So we need to understand what those challenges and we need to start tackling them now. So I'm not harping on the fact that to do all those things the banking system has to be stable, that is given, obvious, right? So to foresee that kind of situations whilst reviving the economy, right, is the challenge that we face today. I think the direction that what we have seen so far in terms of this economy has taken, there were some positive signs, obviously we can see, and hope those continues with the right policy decisions.
With consistent policy.
Consistent policy decisions, and we need to facilitate investments, obviously. We have seen the tourism is picking up, so those are all...
Remittances are coming in.
But once again, a lot of work to be done. $1 billion remittances, banking system gets only 50% of it. So where is the balance 50%? What can we do to bring that back in? Export revenue, it is not only a factor of Sri Lankan economy, the world economy has multiple effects on that. The markets where we export are not doing well. So those also has to be accounted for. So that's why I'm saying it is not somebody saying, you need to grow this, that and, revive. So there has to be a very concerted effort, understanding what repercussions can happen if you don't do it properly, and who should facilitate that revival.
Thank you very much, Damit Palewata. I now move attention to Murtaza Jaffrji.
Thank you, Shamir. I've come to your program after a while, And I believe that the last couple of times I was on your program, I forewarned of an impending economic crisis, which did happen. It happened far worse than my wildest imagination. So we had something like 70% inflation, currency depreciated significantly, there has been broad-based wealth destruction of our people, and the biggest damage to our economy is that the best and brightest in our country are heading to the door. When we had a record amount of 1 million passports issued last year, even companies that I manage, so many of my young people are leaving the country, trying to migrate, which is a huge loss. And this will take many, many years to recover. But now that a mother of all crises has happened, this is once in a lifetime opportunity to fix things. Because what happens in the think tank world, which we call the overturn window, has opened wide. So a lot of ideas that were formerly unimplementable is now possible. So a lot of things that was politically, or for the sake of saying politically not possible, are now possible. And we are seeing on a regular basis that new legislation, etc., is being implemented. One of the most important pieces of legislation that will happen in my life is going to be debated in Parliament next Thursday on the 11th of May, which is the second reading of the Central Bank Bill. Now, this is a very important piece of legislation which is very relevant to the original question you asked about where to invest money, which I will try to touch on. This will quite literally prohibit monetary financing, clause 86. Although the Supreme Court has given some kind of caveat that under extreme situation that they should be able to assist the government for liquidity support, the money printing that has been the bane of our economy will not be possible under law. So the law will allow them to money print for 6 months, but the IMF agreement, unless the bilateral funding as per the program does not come through, they cannot money print. So you can presume that no more money printing from this point onwards. And money printing simply means that the government, the central bank funds the government, and since the central bank is owned by the government, it's quite literally free money, because the central government pays the central bank 25% interest rate, and they pay it all back as dividend, basically, minus a little bit of the expenses. So quite literally free, and therefore, if prices reflect the scarcity value of any resource, if you are creating zero cost money, then the value of money goes down, and that's why you have inflation. So if it comes into law, and it will also have a very independent governance structure, the era of very high inflation, continuous depreciation of the currency going forward will significantly reduce. So that is going to be a game changer for our economy, because the focus now is trying to create real growth through productivity improvements and not trying to stimulate the economy through money printing and excess amount of credit growth. So I remain optimistic going forward, because this time the crash was so large that it has shaken people to the bone. And that is why my involvement in a think tank called Advocata, where we are trying to communicate, especially in the local vernacular, because economic literacy is very, very weak. And therefore, we need to get the buy-in of majority of the people to do all these necessary reform, because Shamir, who will resist this? And I have said this very publicly, that this country has been run for the benefit of 1,000 people. And it is high time that this country be run for the benefit of the 22 million citizens.
Very quickly, Murtaza, we're just hearing the news that Sri Lanka's cabinet of ministers have decided to raise the limit on the issuance of treasury bills up to 6,000 trillion rupees, and the proposal will be tabled in 6 trillion, and the proposal will be tabled in Parliament in the near future, and the amount stood at 5 trillion before. So at a time that we're discussing about domestic debt, how practical is this solution?
Yeah, so that is just the upper limit. It used to be 5 trillion, and since they have already issued 4.7 trillion, it is only normal to increase that from 5 trillion to 6 trillion because of high inflation. The economy is now at about, last year was 24.5 trillion or something. So that is nothing to get excited about, that is a normal thing to do.
Will the DDR have an effect on the Colombo stock market as well in the future?
So, again, I want to say this as a last comment. The fear of DDR is far greater than the actual pain. So since markets are driven by expectations, it is expectations that are driving the weak stock market at the moment. And when this DDR is announced and it goes through, I can assure your viewers that the pain and the damage will be a lot less severe than the expectation. It's like, I'm not a fan of injections. Thinking about the injection is far worse than getting the injection. And then after the injection, you kind of wonder what was the big deal about.
Thank you very much, Murtaza. Thank you very much, Murtaza Jafarji, Chairman of Adhikara Institute, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Damit Palawat, Deputy General Manager of Hatton National Bank. Thank you very much, Damit, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Dr. M. Ganeshamurthy, Department of Economics, University of Colombo. And thank you very much, Attorney at Law,
pleasure to be on.
Manjika Fernandopulle, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Niresh. Thank you very much, Shania and Jayamal, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Tonight, our topic was on domestic debt restructuring. Who will ultimately pay the price? I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. If you think nobody cares if you're alive or not, try missing a couple of car payments and then you will see how important you are in the banking sector in Sri Lanka. Take care and good night.